In the outskirts of New England, whispers tell of a creature once buried beneath the ancient forest, a being they call LABUBU. No one knows where it truly came from, a banished monster from another world, or the spawn of age-old nightmares. But one thing is certain, it never dies. Anyone who hears the chattering grind of its teeth in the dark vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only bones gnawed clean and a strange glimmering tooth that seems disturbingly alive. The old wooden cabin lay deep within the New England forest, where Marjorie Hale and her son Ethan had just moved after years of being pressed into the chaos of city life. Marjorie hoped this remote refuge might soothe the wounds carved into them both, the boy still drowning in the loss of his father, and herself, brittle with grief. Yet from the moment they stepped inside, the air carried a weight that could not be explained away. The walls sagged with rot, flaking paint, peeling like shriveled skin. The floor groaned beneath each step, as if resenting their presence. Beyond the windows, the forest loomed like an endless wall, its branches intertwined, stretching outward like massive hands intent on blocking any escape. Marjorie whispered reassurance inside her own mind, telling herself it was only the strangeness of a new place. But deep within, she recognized that the silence here was not peace. It was a breath held too long, waiting to break. On their first night, the wind shrieked through the cracks, carrying with it the damp stench of rotting leaves. Marjorie lay awake on the ancient bed, eyes wide against the dark. Then, from somewhere within the forest, came a sound. A brittle clicking, the unmistakable gnash of teeth, near, then far, then suddenly rasping right against the window pane. In the room beside hers, Ethan shifted in his sleep, his small bed rattling as if footsteps circled around it. Marjorie held her breath, heart hammering in her chest, as a single thought gnawed at her mind. The tranquility she had sought was nothing but a fragile veil, stretched thin over a nightmare waiting to be awakened. The next morning, a heavy fog smothered the forest, swallowing the sun as though it had never risen. Marjorie awoke exhausted, her mind still echoing with the brittle grinding of teeth from the night before. Ethan sat motionless at the kitchen table, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his expression so empty it was impossible to guess what he had endured in the dark. While cleaning, Marjorie discovered a strange mark on the porch, deep, parallel gouges as though something had clawed through the wood with dozens of sharp talons. Wedged within the splintered cracks, something glimmered. She pried it loose, a long, unnaturally pointed tooth, its surface slick and gleaming, cold as steel. She slipped it into her pocket before Ethan could notice, though a creeping dread gnawed at her chest. That afternoon, she resolved to learn more about the land they had come to. In the small town's general store, locals turned wary and evasive at the mention of her new address. Only one woman responded, an ancient figure seated in the corner, her tangled silver hair framing eyes that seemed to sink into darkness. She called herself Hazel, the oldest surviving resident of the town. Her voice carried no emotion, as though reciting a curse. The forest had once been marked by an ancient being, one the native people had named in a trembling whisper. LABUBU. It was neither animal nor spirit, but a living entity that fed upon human souls. Those who heard the gnashing of its teeth would soon see, in their dreams, a smile stretched grotesquely from ear to ear. And once it appeared in a dream, escape was no longer possible. Marjorie left the store with her hands trembling, her coat pocket heavy with the sharp, unnatural tooth. Hazel's warning rang in her mind like metal scraping against metal. She did not want to believe it, yet denial was impossible. The silence of the forest was nothing more than a shroud,
visitor.
hiding something that had been waiting far too long. Danny, Eldinai. Night fell faster than usual, darkness swallowing the last streaks of color along the horizon. Marjorie sat at her desk, struggling to focus on the page before her. But her thoughts never drifted far from the gleaming tooth. It lay in the drawer, yet seemed to whisper into the silence, a faint clicking sound that prickled her skin with cold dread. Ethan sat in the corner of the room, his gaze fixed on the black expanse of forest outside the window. He said nothing, but his eyes refused to turn away. Marjorie almost told him to go to bed, but hesitation froze her tongue. Some irrational fear that if she looked away, even for a heartbeat, something from the darkness would step inside. That night, the nightmare came for Ethan. He dreamed of a forest unfamiliar, where the moon had been devoured and only a pale, sickly glow remained, cast from countless jagged teeth jutting up from the soil. They clattered together in a deafening chorus, a death-rattle symphony without end. From within that forest of teeth, a pair of hollow eyes opened, and slowly, a smile stretched wide, curling grotesquely to the ears. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his back slick with cold fear. In town, news spread quickly. A young girl named Janice had vanished along the path leading into the woods. Police launched a search, but all they found was her bloodied backpack and scattered shards of bone, pale as chalk. Sheriff Dwayne insisted it was the work of wild animals, a bear perhaps or wolves. But those who saw the remains swore the bite marks were too long, too sharp, to belong to any earthly beast. Marjorie joined the search party, and near the trail's edge she found something she could no longer ignore. Nestled among rotting leaves was a tooth, the length of her finger, gleaming as though freshly polished. When she lifted it, it quivered faintly in her hand, alive with some unnatural pulse, and the sound of grinding teeth throbbed directly in her skull. That night, back at the cabin, she placed the two teeth together. They clicked against one another, a brittle rhythm that sounded disturbingly like words in a language beyond human comprehension. Marjorie froze, breath caught in her throat. Ethan entered the room, his face pale, and whispered that he had seen the smile again in his dreams. Without a single word between them, Marjorie understood. The darkness in the forest was no rumor. It was real, and it was reaching for them. After Janice's mysterious death, the small town sank into uneasy silence. Doors were locked before dusk, streets emptied long before the sun was gone. Yet Sheriff Dwayne clung to his explanation that wild animals were to blame. His words echoed through the loudspeakers in brittle monotony, dry and meaningless. A thin curtain straining to hide the truth, bleeding slowly from the forest. Marjorie knew better. The two teeth in her drawer never ceased their clicking, striking one another in the silence of the room. By night, the sound burrowed straight into her skull, carried on an unseen current that dragged with it fragmented whispers. They spoke of hunger, of a smile widening in the dark. Ethan grew paler with each day, his eyes open wide through the nights, for whenever he dared to close them, he was crushed again by visions of teeth erupting from the earth, hemming him in. One morning, a figure waiting on the porch froze Marjorie in her tracks. It was Richard Cole, an anthropology professor and an old acquaintance from her university years. He had heard that Marjorie had moved here, and more importantly, he had heard of the disappearances. Richard was not surprised. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting it. He opened a worn leather-bound journal, revealing pages filled with faded sketches of a grotesque figure, a gaunt, hunched body, a mouth cleaved nearly across the face, bristling with hundreds of disordered teeth. Richard explained that in the folklore of an ancient tribe once rooted in these lands, there existed a being called Labu. Born of hunger and darkness, it had been sealed beneath the earth through ritual sacrifice. Yet, when that seal weakened, Labu would return, hunting by planting fear and drawing its victims into dreams, where it shredded the soul before ever touching the flesh. Marjorie was struck numb. Ethan's nightmares, the teeth in her possession, everything matched Richard's words. But the most terrifying revelation lay in a line from the old manuscripts. Whoever keeps its teeth shall be the first to be devoured. That night, the grinding no longer came from the drawer. It seeped from the walls, from the floorboards, from the window frames. The wooden house seemed to sprout invisible teeth, clattering against one another in endless hunger. Ethan clutched his head. His scream caught silent in his throat, while his wide eyes reflected a sickly green light from some source unseen. Richard stood frozen, his face ashen, the realization striking him like a blade. Labu was not merely hunting. It had already caught their scent. Outside, the wind ceased. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. From the forest, the clicking rose in a frenzied chorus, a death march rattling through the night, heralding that fear was no longer rumor. It had spread like a plague without form. And at its center, Marjorie's house had become the gathering place for a thing that had waited centuries to wake. That night, the wooden house seemed to transform into a colossal body. Every crack exhaled a clicking rhythm, the sound spreading everywhere like the gnash of 1,000 teeth. Marjorie sat frozen, her fingers clenching the ring of keys, but the whispers seeped into her skull, thick and sticky as sap. They carried no language she recognized, yet their meaning was undeniable. Let us in. Let us taste. Ethan lay curled on the bed, his small frame trembling. His eyes stared wide at the ceiling, where the cracks slowly warped. From the timber, jagged teeth sprouted, lengthening, clattering against one another before breaking loose and falling like hail made of bone. Each piece struck the floor with a high-pitched chime, warped and shrill, like a child's laughter twisted out of shape. Richard Cole scribbled furiously into his journal, sweat streaming down his temple. He muttered of an infiltration stage, the moment when the entity marked its prey. But his words no longer carried knowledge. They read like a death sentence, written out loud in real time. Marjorie rushed to the bed and pulled Ethan into her arms. His body was ice cold, lips tinged blue, his mouth moving faintly. She pressed her ear to him and nearly screamed. Ethan's voice was gone. From his throat came only the rhythmic clatter of teeth, perfectly in sync with the house chorus. Darkness thickened around them, not an ordinary absence of light, but a viscous shroud where twisted forms writhed and pressed against reality. Within it, a grin unfurled, stretching ear to ear, illuminated by a sickly green glow. LABUBU did not step through the door. It split out from the air itself, as if the house had been its womb all along. Its hollow eyes fixed upon Ethan. Marjorie felt the pull of an invisible force, wrenching her son from her embrace. His body rose, suspended in the air, while the teeth erupting from the walls angled toward him, clattering like a triumphant hymn for the predator's feast. Richard screamed without sound, scrolling frantic tribal sigils across the floor with chalk. But the markings dissolved instantly, swallowed whole as though licked clean by the dark. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, realizing every fragment of knowledge he carried was nothing, mere scraps of paper before a hunger older than language. Marjorie lunged, gripping Ethan's hand. A green luminescence spread across his skin, veins glowing like half-chewed strands. In his eyes reflected the vision of an endless forest of teeth, waiting to consume his soul. Then, amid the frenzy of grinding jaws, the room filled with a chorus of whispers. No longer vague, but sharp and merciless. He is mine. You will witness. You will surrender. Marjorie felt her blood congeal in her veins. She understood. LABUBU had chosen Ethan, and her role here was never chance. She was meant to bear witness, or pay the price to keep her son. Outside, the forest convulsed. Leaves rustled, not with the wind, but with the rhythm of countless unseen teeth, laughing. The cabin shook, planks splitting away to reveal a yawning abyss beneath, as though the earth itself were opening its jaws. In that instant, Marjorie knew the nightmare was no longer Ethan's alone. It had stepped into reality, and nothing could stop it. The house collapsed inward like a cage, its wooden walls splitting apart to reveal massive teeth jutting from the darkness beyond. LABUBU emerged, gaunt, hunched, its mouth splitting half its face, lined with hundreds of teeth crowding together, jagged and uneven like a forest of silver blades. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan, suspended in the air, his body bathed in a green glow that shone like a beacon of death. Marjorie lunged forward, desperate to wrench her son free from the invisible force. Her fingers brushed his hand, but Ethan's body was dissolving into ash, pulled toward the gnashing maw of the abyss. The whispers thundered now, sharp and merciless. He is mine. You will surrender. Richard fell to his knees, mumbling fragments of ancient incantations, but every word evaporated the instant it left his lips. Human knowledge crumbled against the raw, primal hunger of the beast. All he could do was witness, helpless, as the monstrous mouth yawned open at the center of the room. Marjorie clutched Ethan tightly, her eyes blazing with defiance. From deep within, she understood. To save her child, another soul must be offered. And the only soul left was her own. Teeth rained around them, gleaming like a storm of knives. She drew one last breath, whispering into her son's ear, "Live." With the final strength in her body, Marjorie thrust Ethan out of the green radiance, hurling him into Richard's arms. At that instant, she was lifted, dragged straight into LABUBU's gaping mouth. Her scream was swallowed whole, merging with the relentless clatter of teeth as the house convulsed like a body choking down the last trace of light. Then, silence. The cabin stood still, lifeless. Ethan lay unconscious in Richard's embrace. Marjorie was gone, leaving only a void of cold air. At the center of the ruined floor, one long tooth still glowed, pulsing faintly, clicking in a steady rhythm, like the breath of something asleep, waiting. Richard carried Ethan from the cabin, never daring to look back. Yet in the forest's darkness, the sound continued, grinding teeth, unbroken, endless. LABUBU had retreated, but it had not vanished. It was waiting for the next hand to pick up the tooth that remained. And when that moment came, the cycle would begin again. Ainun Parwat. In the small town of Vermont, winter smothers every street beneath a suffocating veil of snow, yet its silence conceals an ancient dread. They whisper that if, at midnight, one hears the faint clatter of grinding teeth within the walls, then by dawn someone will be found lifeless, face frozen, lips stretched wide into a grotesque smile. No blood, no wound, only an emptiness too terrifying to name. They call it the Mark of LABUBU, the final smile from which no soul has ever escaped. Endi, Wendeli, Endau, Anhau, Amdi, Capstay. Winter in Vermont draped the land in a blinding pall of white, drowning the town in a silence so deep it seemed frozen in place. On that morning, with frost still clinging to the windowsills, they discovered the body of Mrs. Helen Morris in her weathered wooden house at the edge of town. The door had been left unlocked. Nothing inside was disturbed. The fireplace still glowed faintly with dying embers, and a teacup rested beside the armchair, its contents long since gone cold. Yet what made the blood run cold was not the tranquility of the scene, but her face. Helen's lips had been pulled so wide they seemed to split her countenance, twisted into a grotesque smile, as if forced open by an unseen hand. The corners of her mouth were torn, yet no blood marked the wound. Her eyes stared upward, glassy and vacant, fixed on an eternity no one else could see. Her body remained intact, without the faintest trace of struggle, a statue of flesh arranged to grin forever. The neighbor later recalled that the night before her death, Helen had complained of strange noises in the wooden walls. Like teeth gnashing, she whispered, but no one paid attention. Now, within the house, as neighbors gathered in uneasy silence, some swore they could still hear that faint, clattering sound seeping from the cracks in the ceiling. The town sheriff quickly dismissed it as an unusual death caused by stroke. None dared to argue, yet those who had looked upon Helen's face could not bear to look again. The photograph of her body was hidden away almost immediately, for even a single glimpse was enough to make one's stomach knot with dread. By the following day, word had spread across town. Some whispered of the old curse, handed down through generations. When the hollow smile appears, the soul has already been taken. Others clung desperately to reason, murmuring of rare illnesses or mass hysteria. But in the nights that followed, when the wind died and the silence deepened, families began to hear it. The faint grinding of unseen teeth inside their walls. And all who heard it thought of Helen's face, her endless smile, and the eyes that seemed still to follow the living with a hollow, eternal gaze. Oh, unview. The death of Helen Morris had not yet faded from memory when the town was struck by another shock. Only a week later, the familiar grocer, Richard Palmer, was found lifeless behind his counter. He sat slumped in his swivel chair, one hand resting upon his ledger. No signs of struggle, not a trace of blood, only that same twisted visage, lips stretched into a brittle, unnatural smile.
I can't stay here.
Drawn so taut it seemed the skin might tear apart. The whispers grew louder. Some still muttered of coincidence, but disbelief crumbled when, inside the local schoolhouse, a teacher was discovered collapsed at her desk. She too sat upright, eyes frozen open, her face marked by that grotesque grin. 3 deaths, each body untouched, each face smiling. No one could cling to reason any longer. Unease thickened over the town like a second winter. With every nightfall, the people listened to their walls, holding their breath against the faintest disturbance, dreading the sound of something stirring where no living thing should be. In this oppressive silence, Eleanor Finch, a widow in her 40s, began to notice strange occurrences within her own home. At first, it was only faint clicks within the walls, like metal striking metal. She dismissed it as vermin or the sigh of old pipes. But her son, Daniel, whispered that he heard something more. Laughter, low and disembodied, drifting through his room each night. Sleep deserted her. Eleanor began recording every detail in a small notebook. The time the noises began, the place from which they seemed to echo, the unnatural chill that seeped through cracks in the wooden walls. And with every page, a dreadful realization grew clearer. Each victim had spoken of such sounds days before their deaths. The home that once promised safety now became a silent snare. In the late hours, Eleanor sat rigid in the dark, listening to the dry, relentless grinding of teeth moving through the walls, as though some colossal maw waited patiently to swallow her family whole. And she understood then. The hollow smile was no longer just the misfortune of neighbors. It was advancing, step by step, click by click, toward her very own door. Ni, Anho. Eleanor sought answers in a place long abandoned by most, the old library at the center of town. Its halls were silent, but for the creak of ancient wood, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and the dust that lay thick upon every shelf. As she sifted through crumbling records, her hands brushed against a small volume bound in darkened leather, a forgotten journal belonging to a minister of the 18th century. The yellowed pages chronicled a time of horror. The town had once endured a mysterious plague of smiles. People collapsed in droves, their bodies untouched, their faces frozen in hollow grins. The minister wrote that it was no illness, but rather the work of a thing awakened from the earth. He named it the bringer of smiles, a gaunt silhouette, whose endless teeth ground together in the night. Eleanor closed the book, her heart pounding. She realized she had stumbled upon a secret the town had chosen to bury. Yet, a deeper fear gnawed within her. If the curse had risen once, then it could rise again. That night, the dreams began. She saw her own familiar room drowned in darkness, and in the corner stood a figure, thin, motionless, its face blurred save for the gaping grin carved across it, wide enough to split its head in two. From that smile came the grinding of unseen teeth, a constant, merciless rattle that filled the air. She woke drenched in cold sweat, only to hear the same dry clatter seeping from the walls, as though the dream had followed her into waking life. Daniel, too, began to change. The boy grew pale and hollow-eyed, restless with sleepless nights. One morning, Eleanor froze in terror as she found her son smiling in his sleep. It was no expression of innocence, but a rigid, grotesque imitation of the dead. When she called his name, he gave no answer, only the faint, unconscious gnash of teeth echoing through the room. Horror welled up within her, and yet she understood. This was no accident, no coincidence. The smile was a mark, a sign that her child had been touched by something no human eye could meet. And in the silence of that house, as the beams groaned beneath an unseen weight, Eleanor grasped the truth. The others had only been the beginning. The curse had returned, and now it was reaching for her family. Kelly, Pa, Inxiao, U, and Toru. In the days after discovering the ancient journal, Eleanor lived in a state of unbearable strain. By day, the town slumbered beneath a veil of quiet snow. But when night descended, her house became a hollow chamber, echoing with dreadful sounds. At first, It was only a few scattered clicks from the wooden panels. Yet with each passing night, the noises multiplied, spreading through the halls, along the ceilings, into the bedrooms. They were not the creaks of timber, but the slow, grinding rasp of teeth. Thousands of them, clenching and scraping together, each movement drawn out as if to torment the nerves of anyone who dared to listen. Eleanor soon noticed strange fissures creeping across the walls. They did not split like ordinary cracks. Instead, they curved into arcs, bending like hidden rows of teeth embedded deep in the wood. She struck them with a hammer, desperate to break the illusion. But each time she did, new fissures appeared elsewhere, even along the ceiling, as though the house itself was sprouting a jaw of its own. Daniel was withering. He no longer ate, no longer spoke, but sat for hours unmoving, his eyes dulled and opaque. One night, Eleanor entered his room and found him seated stiffly on the bed, eyes wide but empty. His face had contorted, lips stretching into an unnaturally long smile. When she touched his shoulder, a sound erupted from his mouth, the hideous gnash of teeth grinding together, inhuman, resonant, and cold. Eleanor wept, clutching her son to her chest. But when she lifted her gaze, she froze. On the wall behind him, a shadow had taken form, gaunt, elongated, its head cocked to one side, as though sharing in Daniel's smile. Its mouth gaped open, revealing jagged rows of teeth, clattering in rhythm with the sound spilling from her child. The room grew icy, her breath clouding the air in pale wisps. She staggered backward, trembling, but the shadow did not fade. It only stood, tilting its head, its grin endless and hollow. Every candle in the house sputtered out at once, plunging the room into a suffocating black. From within that dark, the gnashing rose, layer upon layer, until it seemed the entire house had become a single vast mouth, waiting to swallow them whole. When the lights flared back, Daniel collapsed onto the bed, unconscious. The shadow had vanished, yet the smile remained etched upon his face, warped and unyielding, a scar carved into living flesh. Eleanor understood then. It was far too late to hope for help from the outside. What she had witnessed no longer belonged to this world. She had only one choice left, to confront the nightmare itself before it devoured the soul of her son. Outside, snow fell in heavy silence, yet within Eleanor's house the cold was sharper, crueler. That night, as the clock struck 12, the entire house shuddered as though something beneath had stirred awake. The cracks along the walls widened all at once, aligning into vast rows of teeth, opening like a monstrous jaw. From the fissures poured a grinding cacophony, relentless and deafening, the sound of something long imprisoned rising to the surface. Daniel lay motionless on the bed, his face warped by an unearthly smile that split his features wide. His breath came faint and shallow, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the dense blackness gathering in the corner of the room. Eleanor knelt beside him, clutching his icy hand. "I'm here, my son," she whispered, her voice quivering. Yet Daniel's lips only twitched with that lifeless grin, no words returning to her. Then the darkness began to move. From the fractures in the wall, a gaunt shape dragged itself forth. Its head bowed low, its arms long enough to scrape the floor. And when it lifted its face, Eleanor saw the void-wide grin, mouth split ear to ear, endless teeth clashing in a ceaseless grind that froze her blood. It was him, the bringer of smiles. LABUBU. Eleanor, felt her will unravel beneath its gaze. In her mind, whispers slithered, hypnotic and cruel. "Smile, and I will take your soul." Her lips trembled. Muscles tugged at her cheeks against her will. She tried to turn away, but the shadow had filled the room, its presence pressing down upon her from every corner. In the storm of her despair, Eleanor remembered the minister's journal. A single line had glimmered through the haze of dread. Only a sacrifice born of love can halt the hollow smile. She understood then. To save Daniel, she would give what no one else could. She pulled her son into her arms and lifted her gaze to the entity. "If you must take a soul, take mine," she cried, her voice rising above the grinding roar. "But let the boy go." LABUBU tilted its head. Its grin widened, as though it had been waiting for this invitation since time began. It lunged forward, its maw yawning like an abyss. Eleanor shut her eyes, clutching Daniel tight, surrendering to the tide of darkness. The gnashing ceased. Silence swallowed the house. When Daniel opened his eyes, his body shook and tears burst forth. But the arms that had held him were gone. Eleanor was no longer there. On the wooden floor, at the spot where she had knelt, lay a single tooth, long, gleaming like metal, shining cold in the dim light. Daniel cried out for her, again and again, but the house gave no answer. The silence was heavy, as though nothing had ever happened at all. Yet, deep within the walls, faint and steady, a sound endured, the distant grind of unseen teeth, whispering that the hollow smile had not ended. Nen. In New Jersey, there lies an abandoned university dormitory, deserted since the 1970s after a mass disappearance that was never explained. Legends whisper that on nights when the moon wanes, faint laughter drifts through its corridors, mingling with the sound of footsteps wandering aimlessly in the dark.
This place gives me the creeps.
When a group of curious students chose to spend the night there, filming a documentary, they did not realize they had awakened the thing entombed within the walls. By morning, only their bodies remained, perfectly intact, yet their faces contorted by grotesque, frozen smiles. Those smiles were not their own. They bore the mark of Labu, an ancient entity that sows silence through the horror of its grin. The car stopped before the abandoned dormitory, a silent monolith rising like cold stone amid a campus shrouded in mist. Emily Harris, 38, professor of folklore, stepped out. Her breath curled in white vapor as her eyes lifted to the dark windows, sealed behind cobwebs and dust. 20 years earlier, she had been a student here. Though the building had already been closed by the time she arrived, forever etched in memory as a forbidden place no one spoke of. With her was Mark Benson, 40, an independent filmmaker. He carried his camera with a mix of eagerness and unease. Behind them followed 3 students, restless with excitement and joining the project. They believed this trip was nothing more than a chance to document an urban legend. The whispers surrounding the mass disappearance of 1972. But Emily knew that within these walls lurked something far more dreadful. The wooden door shrieked as it gave way, releasing a flood of damp, frigid air. The hallway stretched forward, its peeling paint like rotting flesh. Each step they took reverberated, echoing into an endless void. Faded student portraits still clung to the walls, their smiles warped beneath a veil of dust, twisted into strange, frozen grimaces. That first night, they laid out their sleeping bags in a large room.
Students were found
Mark
intact,
positioned his
mouths
camera
stretched
toward the
into
corridor,
unnatural grins.
hoping to capture any
No
sign
signs
of
of
movement.
violence.
Emily sat by the window, sifting through old records of the case. In a yellowed newspaper clipping, her eyes caught a line stark in its brevity. Students were found intact, mouths stretched into unnatural grins. No signs of violence. Around midnight, as the others slept, Emily heard a sound. At first, she thought it was merely wind whistling through cracks. But when it came again, her body froze. It was not the wind. It was a steady, deliberate clicking, as though teeth were grinding just beside her ear. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound seeped from within the walls, threading through the corridor, reverberating through the very bones of the building like a hidden pulse. Emily's gaze swept the darkness, and in the faint light, she swore she saw the cracks along the wall, bending, curving into the outline of an immense jaw slowly parting. The air thickened with the certainty of a presence in the hallway, watching, smiling, breathing with them. Emily clutched the papers in her hands, her mind sharp with one dreadful truth. This was no legend. They had awakened something. Nay, Sheikh. The next morning, pale light filtered weakly through the dust-choked windows, illuminating the desolate corridor. Emily opened her eyes, her chest still heavy from the night's strange symphony of sounds. She sat up, stepped out of her sleeping bag, and instantly felt the suffocating stillness. No soft snoring, no restless chatter of young students, only silence pressing against her eardrums like a weight. When she turned, her heart seized. On the cot in the corner, Rachel's body lay motionless. Her eyes were wide open, void of pain, yet her face was stretched into a grotesque smile, unnaturally long, her lips frozen in a hideous arc. No wounds, no blood. Simply life gone, leaving behind a flawless shell and a hollow grin. Mark rushed forward, panic in his movements, camera in hand. He tried to capture the scene, but when he played the tape back, the image fractured into streaks of black and white static. Only the sound remained intact, a jagged, repetitive clatter, sharp as bone against bone. The grinding of countless unseen jaws hidden deep within the walls. The two remaining students stood paralyzed, terror etched in their eyes. Emily forced herself to remain composed, though her hands trembled as memory clawed at her. The records from 1972 had spoken of deaths exactly like this. Bodies untouched, preserved as though in sleep, yet every face marred by that unmistakable smile. She knelt beside Rachel, staring at the twisted expression. That smile was not the girl's own. It belonged to something else, something that had used her features as a mask, a message to those who dared intrude. The room grew oppressive. From the ceiling, flakes of paint began to fall, revealing a network of hairline cracks spreading across the plaster. They bent and curved, intersecting until they resembled the outline of clenched teeth. Emily's breath caught. The building itself was changing, reshaping into the vast maw of something monstrous, and Rachel was only the beginning. In that moment, she understood. The dormitory was never abandoned. It was alive. It was smiling through the faces it had stolen, and they had only brushed the surface of the truth. Ah, Adi, LABUBU. A heavy silence weighed over the dormitory. Rachel's body had been shrouded beneath an old blanket, yet her frozen smile lingered in the minds of the others like a brand no one dared forget. The two remaining students whispered about leaving, but Emily forced them into calm. The blizzard outside had sealed every path. They were trapped, Survival depended on unearthing whatever secrets the building kept buried. Emily led the group into the basement. Darkness clung thickly to the air, their flashlights sweeping across splintered chairs and file cabinets smothered in dust. Amid the rot and debris, Emily found a leather-bound notebook, its cover torn and frayed. When she opened it, the stench of mold and ash rose, but the words within, trembling, uneven strokes, were still legible. It was the journal of a student from 1972, the sole survivor of that year's tragedy. The first entry made her breath catch. We heard laughter in our sleep. When I opened my eyes, my friends were smiling at me, but it was not their smile. They did not speak. They only sat there, waiting. The pages that followed spiraled into terror. Each night brought the sound of teeth gnashing within the walls. The writer described it as a choir of bone and enamel. One student vanished inside the bathroom, leaving behind only damp air and a mirror etched with a strange face, its grin stretching unnaturally from cheek to cheek. The final entries were broken, the ink warped by tears. I escaped, but when I looked back, they were all still there, motionless, their smiles frozen like masks. I know one day it would come for me, because even now, the grinding teeth echo in my ears every night. Mark filmed close-ups of each page, his face drained of color. The two students pressed into one another, whispering, unable to raise their heads. Emily finished reading, her chest tightening as though the basement itself were crushing in around her. The cracks in the walls here were not ordinary. They bent into curved arcs, converging like the joints of a vast, unseen smile. Then the familiar sound returned. The grinding of teeth, louder now, heavier, as though emanating from the journal itself. Emily snapped it shut, but the noise swelled, reverberating through the basement, circling them with a suffocating pulse. The flashlights flickered, then died. In the darkness, Mark muttered the name of one of the students, but only faint laughter replied. When the light returned, one of the two was gone. Only a backpack remained on the floor, its zipper torn open, and on the damp concrete, a slender curve had been etched, as though a new smile had just been carved into the world. Emily staggered, her heart hammering. She understood now. The journal was not merely a record. It was an invitation, and the fresh disappearance proved that the cycle of 1972 had begun again. The grinding no longer came in scattered bursts. It thundered all at once, as though hundreds of jaws were clenching around them. Emily dragged Mark and the last remaining student, Lisa, up from the basement. But when they emerged into the corridor, the dormitory was no longer the same. Cracks along the walls had split wider, curving into grotesque arcs that met and intertwined, stretching into endless, distorted smiles. Fluorescent bulbs flickered violently, then burst, shards falling like shattered teeth. Each step made the floor groan, the sound resonant like a lowered jaw, grinding against an unseen upper. Lisa sobbed, her trembling hand pointing toward the far end of the hall. Doors along both sides creaked open in unison. From within, blurred faces peered out, all of them smiling. No footsteps, no breath, only hollow figures, their frozen grins and vacant eyes fixed upon them. Mark raised his camera, desperate to capture proof, but the lens recorded only a single image, an immense set of teeth filling the frame. He stumbled back in horror. When he looked again with his own eyes, the figures were gone. The corridor stretched empty and endless, saturated with the metallic stench of blood. Emily clutched the journal tightly, searching for guidance. In the final entry, the survivor of 1972 had scrawled, "If you want to escape, you must return to the place where it first began to smile. But beware, the smile never closes." "The common room," Emily whispered. It was where the students had once gathered, the heart of the dormitory. They raced up the shadowed stairwells. On each floor, the walls trembled, plaster crumbling like gums seeping blood. Overhead, cracks stretched into curving lips, drawing shut as if the entire building were preparing to grind them between colossal jaws. The common room stood open. Inside, the vast space yawned beneath a ceiling torn away, exposing the ashen sky. Yet the clouds had contorted into the form of a monstrous smile, upper and lower masses pressing down upon the structure. On the floor, desks and chairs were arranged in a perfect circle. At its center sat a fractured mirror, but the reflection it gave back was not their own. Instead, it revealed another room, brighter, filled with students sitting in silence, every one of them smiling. Among them, Emily recognized Rachel and the student who had only just vanished. They waved, their grins twisting, stretching impossibly wide. Lisa screamed and rushed forward, but Emily seized her arm and pulled her back. At that instant, the mirror splintered with a shriek, the sound of teeth grinding echoing through the chamber. Cracks radiated outward from the glass, racing across the walls, threatening to tear the building apart. Mark shouted, "It's swallowing us!" And it was true. The ceiling sank lower, the floor swelled upward, furniture and debris sliding into the widening void at the center of the room. A true mouth had taken shape, and they stood at the edge of its throat. Emily knew with terrifying clarity, unless they found a way to end the cycle, they would be consumed, their faces added to the endless, eternal smile. Ni? Oh. The common room shuddered violently. Cracks widened along the walls, bending into grotesque curves like sprawling mouths. Segments of concrete broke loose, crashing down with the sound of teeth being torn from bone. The dormitory itself was sealing shut around them. Mark clung to the camera, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "We have to break the mirror," he shouted. Lisa screamed, clutching her head, as the deafening grind of invisible jaws roared in her skull, driving her toward madness. Emily tightened her grip on the journal. The words returned to her mind. "If you want to escape, you must return to where it first began to smile." Her gaze fell upon the fractured mirror. It was the threshold, the origin, and the end. "Don't look at it," Emily cried, but too late. Lisa's eyes had already locked onto the faces within. On the other side of the glass, Rachel and the vanished students smiled back, their grins splitting wider, tearing toward their ears. Lisa's body trembled, then lurched forward into the circle of chairs. She hurled herself at the mirror and vanished, her form swallowed in an instant, leaving only a shrill, piercing laughter echoing in the chamber. Mark staggered backward, his face pale. "We can't escape. It wants us. It wants everyone to smile." Emily knew there was only one path left. She tore pages from the journal and scattered them around the mirror like a seal. The words, written in a desperate, trembling hand, ignited the moment they touched the ground. Green fire erupted, casting the chamber into an unholy glow. In that light, its true form was revealed. Not a person, nor a multitude, but the dormitory itself. Every wall was a gum, lined with teeth, every crack a bleeding fissure, every window an unblinking eye. The structure laughed with its entirety, its smile eternal and unyielding. Emily turned to Mark, her gaze steady. "One of us must remain to bind it. You must survive to tell them what waits here." Before Mark could protest, she hurled herself into the mirror, clutching the journal tight against her chest. The green blaze consumed her, devouring both her body and the glass. The room convulsed with a final thunderous gnash of teeth, and then fell silent. When Mark opened his eyes, the dormitory lay still. The cracks had vanished, the ceiling restored, the mirror reduced to a scatter of lifeless shards. Lisa, Rachel, the countless others, gone without trace. He stumbled outside. The sky was clear. The storm had lifted. Yet, within his ears, faint and insistent, lingered the grinding of unseen teeth, like a lullaby, both familiar and inescapable. Mark understood then. The loop had not ended. It merely waited, patient, for another smile to open it once more. "Ooh, ni nei, anh đào, hai."